Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Brunvand from the University of Utah, and I am going to talk today about relocalizing the academic library. So I want to make it clear from the start that I'm talking about regular library collections right now, not particularly archives, although there's going to be an overlap with the kind of work that archives do. So we're talking about the Anthropocene, and the idea is geologic in origin. It's a layer of debris that's going to coat the Earth, and the geologists defined a new era because this is going to be a marker, much like the layer of iridium that marks the Chicxulub meteor strike that wiped out the dinosaurs. So whereas that Chicxulub meteor marked the fifth extinction, the layer of plastic and stuff left by human activity is going to mark the sixth extinction. A new geologic epoch in which the entire global environment has been altered by humanity is E.O. Wilson's definition. A long time ago, back in the Holocene, I got a bachelor's degree in geology. And what geologists do for fun is they got in the field with a rock hammer and a piece of and a notebook, and they draw maps. And then they go back to camp and they drink beer and they make up stories about deep time. So we used to call our stories geofantasy. When you study geology, the landscape starts to look different. You start to see into deep time, and you see the tectonic effects and the orogenic effects that build mountains and the erosional processes that tear them down. And you see the whole process of how things got that way. And so this idea here of the Great Stone Book seems kind of fanciful, but it's kind of real. You can learn to read a history in the debris that's left behind. And so I think that's a fantastic idea for libraries in the age of the Anthropocene. When you look up the word in the Web of Science, you find out that it's gotten away from geology and entered into all these other disciplines. So literature and arts and humanities are showing up there. The idea has been adopted and transferred into a lot of different areas. And it's become interdisciplinary. And it's very open to interpretation depending on your own worldview, but it basically just describes an Earth entirely enveloped and engineered by humans. So the Anthropocene allows people to reinforce and perpetuate their preferred views about these implications of human interactions on systems. And somebody has actually started a journal with the name in the title. So this idea of the end of nature first entered the public consciousness because of Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, in 1989. And he didn't call it the Anthropocene, but he mentioned, the book is about how nothing is free of human influence anymore. But the book that Bill McKibben wrote that's even more important to librarians is the one that came after, which is called The Age of Missing Information. And if you haven't read that, you should, even though it was written before the internet. What Bill McKibben did is he sat down and watched all of the TV on cable TV channels and compared that to sitting on top of a mountain. And he compares the information he got from experiencing a local environment to the television, where he'd never even heard a regional accent. There was no news about his local community. So he asked the question, how do people learn about the places where they actually live when they have this globalized media environment? So read the book. There's a history of authors writing about this experience of placelessness. These are just a few selected titles where they're worried about people are losing the experience of place, that the commercialized culture doesn't represent any particular region or bioregion or experience of anything. James Howard Kunstler calls it the geography of nowhere, which is an extremely evocative title. And in 1994, in Becoming Native to This Place, Wes Jackson asked the question, what do you learn at the university that connects you to any sense of who you are in a place in the world? There's no such thing as a homecoming major, he says. What if the universities were to ask seriously what it would mean to have, as our national goal, becoming native in this place and this continent? So this idea of who we are and how that connects to where we live is something that people have been thinking about for a long time. Universities are actually kind of weird as far as being placeless, because there's an assumption that the university is teaching a brand of globalized knowledge and that professors and librarians in an academic environment are kind of interchangeable. It doesn't matter where you come from because your knowledge base is universal. I think that in the age of the Anthropocene, that idea of placelessness is wrong. It's not correct anymore. And so I am advocating using the environmental humanities as a model for understanding the places that we live, and using the library collections as a way to tell a story about those places. So one of a locally famous author from Utah, Terry Tempest Williams, was an undergraduate student at the University of Utah. And she, in the Chronicle of Higher Education, in this article, she's expressing that she wanted a curriculum that connected literature and the landscape. And when she proposed this to people, this would have been back in the 70s, they just laughed at her. Like, that's ridiculous, we can't do that. They laughed me out the door, she says. But she persisted, nevertheless she persisted. And she was eventually instrumental in creating one of the first environmental humanities programs of its kind in the United States. This idea had been implemented in European universities, but she brought it to the United States, and in 2005, the University of Utah started an environmental humanities graduate program. It doesn't have that many students, but the core of this curriculum is a class that's called the Ecology of Residency. And it's designed as a field course to explore with students what it means to live in a community and engage in place. This is the course description. Various sites will serve as a focal point for these discussions within a regional context of issues pertinent to the surrounding community. Members of the community will share with their students their own stories of engagement, ranging from an understanding of ecology to economic sustainability. Guest speakers expand the concept through their own experience. So one thing that I like to do as a librarian is I like to occasionally to look at student dissertations and see what they're citing. And so I took a look at some of the environmental humanities dissertations because it was a new field and I wanted to see what it looked like. It looks like humanities because they use a lot of books. The little gray slice up there is government information. So what that represents is that the environmental humanities students are pulling in policy as far as what the landscape looks like. So they're writing about a landscape. Why is it the way it is? It's because there's a policy and you get what you plan for. All the little teeny slices up there are various kinds of information that you can use as a research strategy for local information. Things like newspapers, which describe a local community, guidebooks, art and photographs. Photographs particularly document what a place looks like. And personal communication and things like that. So we have this kind of research strategy that reflects researching about place, but that's not really what our libraries look like in academic libraries. We've outsourced a lot of the collection development to approval plans and such. So what our libraries really look like is most of the funding is devoted to licensing electronic publications. Most of the publications are academic journals. What we buy is the same stuff everybody's buying. So that's the wrong strategy if you want to represent place. The theory behind this is that the library is a portal to global information. And that resonates with us, right? We've all heard that before. But it's true that the library is a portal to global information, but it's not a sufficient model. And it leads to policies that don't represent the diversity of places within global ecosystems. Okay, so a lot of libraries are talking about taking this same stuff that's bought by everyone and shoving it into regional repositories because it's duplicates. But while they're talking about this, what they discovered is looking for the unique collections, that the unique collections are regional. So while all regions seem to collect the same general materials, all that duplicated stuff, each region also specializes in their own topics that they're kind of obsessed by, right? So we all know what our obsessions are, but it's not getting reflected in our collections quite the way it should because we're doing these approval plans where we have the same thing that everybody has. So I think that this is key to changing the way that we collect things in order to represent different bioregions, diversity of communities, by looking at libraries as a local node in a global information system instead of a portal into global information. It's a slightly different model, but it works better, I think. So, this article from Annual Review about literature and the environment is a really good entry point to understanding environmental humanities if you haven't thought about it much before. When we think about local and global, there's a bunch of bumper sticker slogans that are kind of overly simplistic, but scholars in the environmental humanities have been thinking pretty deeply about what it means to inhabit a place and how to define place, and it's not as easy as we think. In this article, they have this sentence that really, I think, expresses what I'm trying to express. A strategy for opening the local to the global is to reconceptualize place as a node in a global network. By highlighting that there's no such thing as a local environmental problem, all such problems are part of a network of global processes and issues, right? So we want to look at the local things that are going on and tie it into the bigger stuff, instead of the other way around. Or at least that's what I want to do. So, so that's not how the LibQuals Plus survey defines place. If you've been working in an academic library, they think of place as the lights are on, there's a comfy chair, there's a table. But I think we need to start thinking about the collection as a story about the places that we live, and to think about this kind of hyper-local information that informs sustainability, living with our communities, and making our communities better. So here's some examples. There's a little book about the trees in the garden of a church in Salt Lake, or a bicycle master plan that says how we're gonna get to campus. Or here's a riparian corridor study from Salt Lake City that describes a little creek that needs daylighting. It's mostly underground, but we could do better. So if the environmental humanities gain enough traction, they could initiate a renovation of the university with far-reaching consequences for how knowledge is organized, produced, disseminated, and understood. The environmental humanities people are really confident that they can change the world through poetry and art, and they might be right. They envision that this discipline, and I know that other disciplines have been through this before, that it can become very interdisciplinary and inform the ways that what people want to conserve in their communities and how they want their communities to grow into the future. So what my proposal is that instead of collecting globally to represent these sort of globalized disciplines, that libraries could start with our own local stories as the core of the collections, and then expand from there to define the global collection. So here's a story about Utah. These people are reenacting the Mormon trek out to Utah, which they claim was uninhabited, although there were actually lots of people there. They're carrying American flags because they joined the United States instead of creating their own separate state of Deseret. The Eagle Gate there is the entrance to Brigham Young's old farm, and it's framing the Capitol building. So there's a story about a mythology of how people got into the state, and also a sort of a conflict between church and state. People used to say that this statue of Brigham Young, he's got his back to the church and his hand outstretched toward the bank. So we have a story about church and money, right? So these stories are local stories that everybody kind of knows in the local community, but they inform special collections about history, right? Our special collections department has pioneer diaries and stuff, but that's looking backwards to the past. And we want to look forward to the future and figure out how to tell stories that can actually make change. So here's a story that has made change. This is an environmental story about Utah. And these books that are on the screen have actually had major influence in the discussion about environmental issues. The Place No One Knew is it's a book of photographs, right? It's artistic, but it shows landscapes that were flooded when Lake Powell was dammed. They put a lake in the Glen Canyon Dam. And so these are places you can't see anymore because they're underwater. And that book prompted a whole environmental movement of protecting places that might be lost. We've talked about that in other sessions. Edward Abbey wrote Desert Solitaire, which defines a kind of a relationship with the desert, but also the Monkey Wrench Gang, which sort of, it's a novel, it's fiction, but it advocates direct action. And Terry Tempest Williams wrote this book, Refuge, which is about nuclear downwinders, people who were affected by above ground nuclear explosions in Nevada, and floods that were damaging a bird refuge, right? So these are the environmental narratives. And they've actually had real world effects as far as generating protest movements and activist movements. So Terry Tempest Williams and Stephen Trimble created this book, Testimony, in 1995 in order to protest a bad bill in the US Congress that was going to do a hard release on wilderness. So they were trying to pass a bill that said, we're going to pass a Wilderness Act. Anything that's not declared wilderness can never be wilderness ever. So they got a bunch of writers together and poets and stuff, and they put their stuff in this book, and they distributed it to every member of Congress. In the foreword, Terry Tempest Williams says, after the press conference, a journalist asked, what will you do if this book makes no difference? And she said, writers never know the effect of their words, right? But it made a huge difference. They didn't pass the bill, and so let's see if I can make this, can this run? This should have a little movie in it. There it is. So here's a movie about the people who read the book The Monkey Wrench Gang, and there's me protesting, and there's Tim DeChristopher. So what this movie is about people who are inspired by reading Edward Abbey to take action, and it's called Wrenched. You can see that Tim DeChristopher was a student at the University of Utah, and he was inspired to protest climate change by posing as a bidder, and he bid on oil and gas leases at a BLM auction in order to buy them so that the oil and gas companies wouldn't be able to buy them. And so all those people that were running through the streets were supporting Tim DeChristopher and at a protest. And that was right after he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and they went out and did a direct action and blocked traffic and stuff. But you can see that the Monkey Wrench Gang is on the T-shirt behind him and Edward Abbey's life vest. So this kind of literature actually provokes action and inspires people to do something, right? So it's not just looking at the past, it's looking at how that changes the future. We have people in our community who have knowledge of deep time past. So there's been Native Americans in the area for thousands of years, and they're still there. So the story is that this website over here is the Utah Diné Bikea, which is the organization of grassroots Navajos that what they did is they developed a plan for the Bears Ears National Monument by conducting interviews with tribal elders about their relationship to the landscape in southeast Utah. So they convinced President Obama to declare a national monument in the area, and what's happening right now is that the Cowboys and Indians story has reemerged. So that Utah politicians are trying to undo the monument that represents a chance to protect this landscape, right? So we have all these stories now. We have the story about tribal sovereignty. We have stories about Native American history. We have stories about public lands issues. And in my opinion, what we should do is start with this story and then broaden the collection to globalize it into those areas, so that the whole collection is deriving out of our local story and not the other way around, right? Not the other way around where we do global first. So I'm using these stories as an example, and I hope that what's happening in your mind is you're thinking about the stories in your place that might drive this kind of collecting. I'm not saying limit it to Bears Ears or limit it to Navajos, but that this issue taps into this whole thing of tribal sovereignty, and because this is a local story, our library should be like the best library in the world with stuff about tribal sovereignty. If you guys want it, we would have it because we're a node in this global information system. And by doing this, we take advantage of the geographic distribution of libraries in order to build a collection that reflects local place as well as this sort of globalized knowledge. So once again, the story that I showed has generated new writing. Red Rock Testimony was inspired by the other testimony book. Stephen Trimble was involved in that again to send this book to Congress. They created a beautiful chapbook. Edge of Morning has native voices, and there's an artwork right there, a pin that you can buy to wear. Some of the stories seem kind of funny. So when I first started trying to write this, I tried to write an article, and I wanted it to be serious. And I accidentally wrote a parody because a lot of local stories are kind of funny. And those funny things they resonate. So I ended up sending it into a Western weird anthology, and they took it. But here's some of those funny stories. And one of our state artwork in Utah is the Spiral Jetty, which was created by land artist Robert Smithson. And I don't know if you know about him, but he was very stoned most of the time. And it's a sort of a monument to erosion and going back into the earth. Plan 10 is a parody where the Mormon theology has been reinterpreted as a cheesy sci-fi movie, and this is my nuclear jello pin. So these stories also tell us something about our local culture, and also poetry. So I mean, we're not collecting poetry. This stuff is there should be a few more poetry books there. Let's see. Oh yeah, here's some more poetry books. So there's a bunch of poetry that reflects the local landscape, and this is how people feel about where they live. It's published by small presses, it's not coming on approval plans, and you need to hand sell it to get people to read it, but it's important because it informs who we are. Environmental Humanities so Environmental Humanities is producing literature and also producing scholarship, and there's a manifesto which is the Dark Mountain Manifesto, which is calling for new stories in order to create new visions of what the world could be like. So the Dark Mountain Project is calling for writers and artists to start thinking about new stories to tell ourselves. Time up, okay. So I just want to end with this beautiful poem by Jean Valentine. At the library, she passed a tray with little books of baked earth on it. Take one and eat it. It is sweet and it is given for you. Who lives in me, said Earth. We'll do questions later.
Oh, that was great. Thanks, Amy. I was supposed to present yesterday, but I switched with somebody. I was supposed to be in the Crisis and Survival, I think, group. But actually, I think it's perfect going after Amy. Okay. So I'm starting my timer now. So my name's Jodi Shaw. I'm from Brooklyn Public Library, and I'm here today to talk with you about how libraries can foster resilient communities by teaching survival skills, or what I refer to as survival literacy. And when I say resilience, I'm referring to physical resilience. I'm not addressing emotional or psychological resilience, which is intertwined with physical resilience, but I think deserves its own focus, and I'm not focusing on that. So I believe resilience can only be achieved through the process of transitioning away from a centralized infrastructure, aka the grid, to fully decentralized, hyperlocal economies in which all basic human needs are produced by the same people who are consuming them. And I happen to believe this transition is not a choice. I think it's going to happen whether we want it to or not. And I think if librarians can recognize this and accept this, we can be a vital force in helping communities achieve this transition peacefully, hopefully. So it's going to be a very tough but inevitable transition as I see it. And disclaimer, when I speak about the grid, I'm speaking about infrastructures that industrialized nations rely upon. I understand there are many countries that do not have and have never had centralized infrastructures. So, I'm specifically speaking about cities, focusing on cities, because more than half of the global population now resides in urban areas, and that number is growing. 2, 90% of our urban areas on planet Earth are coastal, so they are all at risk of flooding. And 3, with very few exceptions, the human inhabitants of cities in industrialized nations, much more so than in rural areas, are completely dependent upon the grid for all of their basic needs. So this is what I'm referring to as the grid, and this is what it's used for. Not only is the grid centralized physically, it's also centralized in socio-political power. It's fragile, it's costly, it's difficult to maintain. Older European countries have aging and decaying grids, which they can't keep up with in terms of maintenance, never mind the bureaucratic, political, and financial obstacles. There are many major cities in the United States who are going to need to replace most or all of their infrastructures in the next 2 decades, and they don't know how they're going to do it. So being dependent upon the grid not only makes us vulnerable to potentially catastrophic climate events, but also makes us vulnerable to the whims of local and national government, large utility companies, corporations, and also, I don't think I need to say terrorism. So while the grid gives us so much, it's also what makes us very vulnerable, right? So in contrast, decentralized hyperlocal infrastructures are resilient because one mishap or shock does not cripple an entire swath of population. They are created by the same people who use them, so those people maintain control over their own infrastructure, and they are by default extremely efficient. For example, slums, otherwise known as informal settlements or communities, that rely on totally decentralized systems of survival are the most resilient areas in the world. And many would say, well, slums don't have an infrastructure. They do have an infrastructure, it's just not a formal top-down approach. It's an infrastructure that's bottoms up, created by the people who live there. So I just want to throw this out here. I'm sure probably a lot of you already thought of this. A lot of the high-tech world we inhabit, like iPhones and driverless cars and all this high-tech stuff is using a very old energy sources and energy systems to drive it that we've been using since the 1800s. So just to put things in perspective. And the goal, of course, is renewables, right? So solar, wind, hydro are renewable energies. However, the mechanisms we use to capture, store, and distribute those energies are not renewable. Large wind turbines need to be manufactured and mined. They're made out of steel or whatever they're made out of. And photovoltaic panels require mining of precious metals that take the earth thousands of years to produce. They need to be manufactured, they need to be shipped. These are all grid-reliant structures. So the parts and pieces to any technology we use, I'm positing needs to be buildable on site by the user at the point of consumption. I know that this is a big learning curve, right? Like, how are we going to do that? Libraries. So libraries can help in 2 ways with this transition. We can store and provide the information we need to fend for ourselves, and we can also facilitate the organization of communities into functioning hyperlocal economies. I'll talk more about that later. So I'm just going to throw out some ideas here. I do not have answers. These are merely suggestions and scenarios for how we might meet and how libraries might help people meet the list of basic needs. You might have a different list. I know some list had like fiber on it. I mean, I'm sure there are many things we need, but this is very basic. That being said, I don't really have any suggestions for air. The air is polluted both naturally and by human-made processes, and I like to think that as we become more decentralized, there will be less human-caused pollution. But I also am aware that in places like Africa, where 2/3 of the population don't have access to energy infrastructure or electricity, suffer high rates of lung disease because they're burning things like wood and garbage and plastic and cow patties to heat their food and stay warm. So I don't know what to do. Let's move quickly on to the next one. Water. These are the things we need water for. And you'll notice that I have sanitation crossed off. And that's a big one because we use a lot of water for sanitation. And the fact is we do not have to do that. Less than 1% of the water on planet Earth is fresh drinking water. The other 1.5% or so is locked up in ice caps, which will soon be in the ocean. So we really need to stop contaminating our water supply with our feces. Okay, this is really unnecessary. Waterborne illnesses are the leading cause of disease and death on planet Earth. That's according to the World Health Organization. The vast majority of these illnesses are caused by drinking water contaminated with feces. Cholera, typhoid, hepatitis A, other diarrheal diseases, dysentery. Centralized sanitation systems are not only unnecessary, but they make us sick. When cities flood, or even stormwater overflows causes sewage to rise, and we're walking around in our own feces. This is like, to me, it's a no-brainer. The solution to this is waterless sanitation, and I'm going to talk about that more. So our primary needs for water are simply for consumption for ourselves and the animals and plants we might need to survive, and basic hygiene. So here are some ideas, and you'll notice not all of my ideas are completely off-grid, and that's because I think some of these things, this information is still information we need to have in the library because it might be of value conceptually, or there might be some way we can emulate it in another way. I think human beings are incredibly creative and innovative, especially when they have to be, so having jumping off points is good. The easiest way to harvest water is rainwater. It's actually quite clean. It's actually on a par with many municipal water supplies. Of course, you don't want to be drinking rain near, a hot radioactive site or collecting it off of a dirty building or a dirty puddle. So communities are going to need to learn how to harvest rain. They're going to need to build clean systems for capture and storage. Again, this is something a library can teach, knowledge that we can pass on to our communities. The other common source of drinking water is groundwater. Of course, you have the issue with heavy metals. There's a group in Italy that's working on using coffee grounds, sugar, and silica to create sponges that absorb 99% of the heavy metals in water. Can we do that on our own? I don't know. Will we have access to coffee? I don't know. Maybe we can grow coffee, but having an idea like this in the library is like, maybe we can build something like that. If you're in an area of the world that does not have rainwater, drinking water, desalination is a big deal right now in China and Saudi Arabia and even California. That's a portable solar-powered desalination device. Again, it's solar panels, but it's an idea. And then this was built, inspired by Haiti. It's called a solar still, or the Haitian desalination. It relies on passive solar to condense the water. And then this is a store-bought solar still. It's like really cheap, easy to put together. It might be nice for a library to own one of these, and then how can we emulate this or copy this? How can we build this ourselves? And then this is a DIY solar still. It condenses water from soil and plant material, and then a fog catcher, also produced commercially, but can be made on your own. Okay, food. So the food of the future. When I was thinking about food in a place like New York City, and my talk today is very New York City centric, I'm sure you've noticed, I was thinking about how can a place like New York City produce its own food, and I immediately thought of rooftop farming, right? It seems like obvious. Well, so did this guy named Dixon Despommier. He's the author of The Vertical Farm, Feeding the World in the 21st Century. Some students of his went to the NYPL map room and measured and found out that if we farmed every square inch of roof in New York City, it would only feed 2% of the projected population for 2050. So he came up with this idea called vertical farming. And as you can see, there's so many problems right away, right? It's completely dependent on the grid. It's inside. They're using lights to grow the plants. They don't use soil. It uses a proprietary water system with nutrients. And all this needs to be manufactured. The other huge problem here is it's all lettuce, okay? They haven't figured out a way to grow calorie-dense food. So this is right now not a viable solution, but the concept, vertical farming, I wouldn't have thought of that. So I think, again, important information for us to have on hand. So I go back to rooftop farms, and we have some rooftop farms here in New York City, for-profit ones that are doing quite well. So that just demonstrates rooftop farming is viable. And we have some chickens being raised on roofs here, beehives. And in other parts of the world, people actually raise livestock on their roofs, pigs in Mexico City. And I'm sorry, I don't know where this is. I'm a bad librarian that I don't know where this picture came from, but I don't think it's the United States. Good old-fashioned hunting and gathering. There's lots of edible plants in the city. That's me picking dandelion greens, which I was brave enough to eat the other night. This is information that can be stored in the library, like what's edible, what's not, how do I prepare it, where do I find it, how can I grow it? And then wildlife. So we have a lot of potential meat sources in the city. We don't see them as such. We see them as pests. They are thriving so well that we cannot kill them fast enough. We cut them down and they grow back. They're like hair, okay? So if we can just shift our mental processes to, again, in other parts of the world, no problem. Like, this is food. So if we can make that mental leap that this is a food source, we will see that we have quite a colorful menu on hand in the city. Okay, so shelter. This is, so decentralized shelter. You're looking at it. This is a favela, otherwise known as a slum, in Rio de Janeiro. This area was not purchased by a developer or a government or an NGO and built and then rented or leased out to tenants. It was constructed completely by the people who live there. So 1 out of 8 people live in slums. Some areas in Africa, some urban areas in Africa, it's up to 70% of urban areas live in slums. And I think, if you, taking aside the sanitation issue, that's a big one for slum dwellers, that we actually have a lot we can learn from slum dwellers. Okay, so this is a great quote, just demonstrates the resilience of slums. This is in Mumbai, and this is Lagos, which is in Nigeria, but it's not, Lagos actually looks more like the left picture. This is a rendering that somebody came up with of like what Lagos could look like in the future as we restructure it to account for rising ocean tides with floating buildings and all that. It's not going to happen, but again, information that we can have on hand. It's like, might be good for some ideas, right? So now I'm going to talk about my favorite topic in the world, sanitation. So this is our sanitation system here, industrialized, and this is sanitation system for many other parts of the world. Neither, I think, are viable. So we literally, we need to start composting our feces. I mean, the time has come. We're using tons of we're putting tons of chemical fertilizer into the soil. It's ruining the soil. We have a very rich source of soil coming out of our own bodies. We flush 6.8 billion gallons of water down the toilet every day, along with millions of pounds of natural fertilizer. So luckily, we have this guy named Joe Jenkins. He's awesome. He lives in New Jersey, and he's been composting his own shit for 37 years. He's perfected it. It's very simple, very easy, very cheap. You can build toilets. He's gone into some places where they built toilets from found materials. But the process itself is very specific. And so if you don't do it right, you can't just like open your window and throw your shit out the door. That's happening here, like that. Obviously, that's how people die, right? So you have to do it properly so it doesn't infect the groundwater. And he's found a way to do that, and he grows all his own food from it, and it's amazing. And he's proved that it can work on a large-scale basis. He went into post-earthquake Haiti, into a village in Port-au-Prince of about 1,000 people, and trained people, and they made their own complete composting facility. And this is it on the lower right. You can see there's no pipes, there's no water, there's no electricity. And it's all a process, and the community participates, and there's a young man up there who's been trained. I believe he's taking he's looking at the temperature of the compost, because it has to reach a certain temperature to kill the pathogens. So this can work. Okay. So when we think about energy, I think Howard's not here today, but he was talking about how much fuel do we really need. I think it's good to ask ourselves, what do we need and what do we want? Not like we have a choice, right? But do we need televisions, iPods, stereos? Probably not. I'd say we don't. Do we need flush toilets? No, definitely not. Do we need heat? Yeah, we need heat. Are there other ways to get heat? Yeah, probably. Do we need advanced medical techniques? Do we have a choice? That's a hard one. If we're thinking about a future where there's a very different scenario, then the advanced medical techniques might not be happening anymore. So as far as going off-grid energy-wise, on the left is what I call an off-grid, on-grid house, because it's completely self-sustaining, but yet it requires the grid both to build and maintain. So, but again, it's a good sample or an idea to have. And then on the right are just some suggestions. There's actually a guy in Japan who came up with radiational cooling refrigerators, and I can't explain radiational cooling right now, but it's non-electric, and he does all these things non-electric. He was really into the non-electric lifestyle. So I think refrigeration's an important thing to have. Pedal sewing machines, bicycles. If we're living in hyper-local economies, do we need to be flying places? Do we need trains? No, probably bikes will be good. Okay, so security. This is a really important issue, and this is one place where the library can help communities organize their security systems. And I'm not going to really get into that so much, but okay, information. Where do we find all this information? Again, in the library. I apologize to all the digital archivists out there, but I think that anything that relies on a powered machine to look at or access is not really going to fly moving forward. I don't mean tomorrow. I mean in this decentralized world. I think hard copy, local, possibly even oral, such as Jan was talking about yesterday, that those older ways of transmitting knowledge are going to be what we need. So libraries, let's recap. So like, what mushrooms are edible? How do I catch and slaughter and eat and cook a Canadian goose? How do I build a great rat trap? What herbs can I take for plants? Hey, all that information's in my local library. How do we know what materials our community has? How do we assess what materials we still might need? What do we want to do? Who's going to compost the poop on their roof? Who's going to grow the food on their roof? How are we going to organize for security? Again, all this can happen in the library. And then I just want to end with, I really like this. This is the Chinese symbol for crisis. It's two characters. The first character is danger, and the second character is opportunity. Thanks.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer King. I'm the director of the library at Hampshire College, and I am an archivist who became a library director, in part to try to unravel barriers to collaboration among the archives in the 5 College Consortium where I work. I'm going to talk today about libraries and archives adapting to change. Ira Tanzi pointed out in her article, Archival Adaptation to Climate Change, archivists and libraries have done a good job of rallying to respond to the gigantic shift that automation has had on our work the same kind of capacity to transform our work that was needed to cope and manage the digital revolution will be needed, and then some, to navigate preservation of cultural resources in the face of rising seas. I'm going to offer two different scenarios of adapting to change. The first will be the example of an undergraduate liberal arts library adapting and redesigning to support changing needs of its campus. And then I'm going to talk about the adaptation required of archives in response to rising sea levels. And I'm going to somehow make those two connect. Before I do that, I want to start off by telling you about a lecture I attended a couple of years ago that has had me thinking about archives and climate change. Elizabeth Merritt, Vice President, Strategic Foresight, and Founding Director of the Center for the Future of Museums at the American Alliance of Museums, visited Smith College in 2015 and presented the 10,000-year collection. Merritt shared her insights on what is to come for museums, collections, and archives. And if you ever get a chance to hear her speak, go. Her talk started off by wondering how long museums can maintain their social contracts with the public. She painted a picture of tax-exempt institutions operating largely on public funds, collecting cultural resources, and effectively locking them up in museum-grade temperature and humidity-controlled secure museum space, and very occasionally allowing people to see the art and antiquities humans have made on Earth. Museums collect works to preserve them, to curate them, to make sure that they endure forever. For how long? For what purpose? So the slides I'm going to show you now are a version of what Elizabeth gave that was sort of mind-blowing to me. So here's some questions. Are we preserving these collections to last forever? The universe is 13.82 billion years old. Or perhaps forever means how long the Earth has existed. Earth is Earth is 4.54 billion years old. Or maybe forever starts with human life on Earth. Human life has been around for about 6 million years. Civilization as we know it is only about 6,000 years old, and industrialization started in earnest in the 1800s. The Center for the Future of Museums publishes a Trends Watch annually, and I do wonder where the Center for the Future of Archives is. The 2015 Trends Watch included a section on rising tides. Even the relatively conservative estimate by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change forecasts the global sea level could rise 3 feet by the end of this century. With a 10-foot rise in sea level, the U.S. would lose 28,000 square miles of land. Research suggests that projection could play out in the next century. The effects of rising seas, more frequent violent storms, and flooding due to severe rain events are exacerbated by the fact, which Jodi mentioned a minute ago, that throughout history humans have settled by water, not just for practical reasons, but because blue space has a deep positive impact on our well-being. Recently, at the request of the American Alliance of Museums, IMLS used data from the Museum Universe data file to identify museums and related organizations that lie within U.S. coastal areas. IMLS found that 34.6% of museums and related organizations are within 100 kilometers of the coast. Wrap your heads around that, and imagine how many archival repositories are along the coastline too. One idea Elizabeth suggested is that museums create, individually or in collaboration with other museums, off-site storage collections in areas that have lower risks. I'm going to come back to this idea of designing off-site collection spaces in a few minutes. In addition to identifying these profound and significant challenges of climate change and rising sea levels, when asked about libraries and trends going forward, Elizabeth recommends re-examining every assumption you have about what a library is. What is essential and what is merely tradition? Start with that inventory and build a library and program resilient enough to adapt to future needs. At Hampshire College, I have been leading a transformation of a library that has always challenged almost every assumption about what a library is. Hampshire, nestled in the Seven Sisters in Western Mass, was established in 1970 as an experiment in undergraduate education that prepares students for a changing world. The institution that many refer to as the New School bravely and boldly modeled a form of education that is not delivered through the traditional structure of the course, but is experience-based, learner-centered, and inquiry-driven. Hampshire's curriculum is exactly what Billy Templeton was advocating for yesterday in his talk about public schools. Hampshire's library was also designed as a library for the future, challenging assumptions about the library. In this report, which is in our DSpace repository, and I encourage everyone to read it because it's so exciting to read these ideas that were published in 1969, ideas that have predicted all of the trends that academic libraries have been going through in my lifetime. But I think the most salient point of this report is that the library can no longer be a sophisticated warehouse storing and dispensing knowledge to students who happen to come through the door. At the founding of Hampshire College, the focus of the library was on the changing formats of information. Technology was at the heart of this library's design, media, knowledge production, and also gave printed material as much credence as visual art. So the art gallery and the art collection are part of the library. But beyond understanding the impact automation would have on libraries, the caution in this report is that the library must be open-ended. And even at an experimental institution like Hampshire College, it is very challenging to remain in an open-ended process of being. So bringing this concept forward of an open-ended or adaptable library, the library under my leadership at Hampshire has been extending itself to become a knowledge commons and serve as the campus hub for traditional library, media, and archival resources alongside instructional technology, writing, speaking. Yesterday somebody was saying something about libraries teaching exposition skills, student success coaching, and faculty development. All of this expansion has been supported by a significant grant from the Andrew Mellon Foundation. So that's a really cool story about a library's adaptability, but I want to get back to climate change and archives. In Ira's article, she identifies climate change as one of the greatest contemporary threats to archival repositories and the records in their custody. Increasingly, severe disasters like hurricanes, floods, and wildfires pose immediate dangers. The amount that water rises is quite variable from place to place depending on local factors such as land, subsistence, and groundwater extraction. For example, the 600-mile stretch of the East Coast from Cape Hatteras in North Carolina to Maine has experienced some of the fastest rates of sea level rise anywhere in the world since the 1970s. I think it's obvious that we want to work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change, but equally we must begin to prepare much more urgently, not just for the climate impacts that are already becoming manifest, but also for those that are locked into the system and will be worsening in the coming decades. I think the moment is upon us to re-examine the archives and re-examine every assumption behind the work that we are doing. Are archives open-ended resources, and do they become hubs for engagement like the Interference Archive proposed yesterday? Are archives primarily repositories? If archives are repositories, and if the goal is preservation of archives, then what are we doing with sea levels rising? Is the existing model of small private and public universities and repositories spread across the country and the world a good model when 10 or 20% of land will be submerged? So I'm deeply worried and frustrated that this impending disaster is largely ignored and is largely not understood. But because I'm a library director, my thoughts also go to library trends of developing shared regional print archives and high-density storage facilities as possible models for how to take care of the immense numbers of collections that will need to be evacuated or be lost. And I'm worried that archivists don't have enough experience at negotiating complex shared ownership models, and that the issue of ownership might be one of the biggest obstacles to solutions. As archivists, we are trained to pursue donations over deposits. We like deeds of gifts that transfer ownership and sometimes intellectual property to our institutions. And our institutions invest significant resources into the materials that we accession into the collection. my experience in archives is that that sets archives and archivists and their institutions up to feel profound ownership of their archival collections. And I think that profound sense of identity tied up in the collections is one of the biggest barriers to archivists being able to work across institutional boundaries. So in the 5 colleges, my experience working in a consortium of academic libraries, each with its own archive and in need of more space for collections, better access online, new types of digital preservation and aggregation, there are many barriers to collaboration. The reasons to not build systems together always make sense in the moment. We can't share donor data. We can't place our collections in the shared depository because we won't maintain ownership of the records. Our programs and institutions are too different. I've been working around this challenge for most of my career, and when I think of rising sea levels, I think we need to start learning how to overcome the differences and start learning how to work through agreements. Libraries have been doing this for a long time. It's harder for archives. Rick Prellinger suggested as much yesterday when he speculated that regional shared print archives hold promise. Libraries have been joining together to share high-density facilities to support print collections in mutually agreed upon nearby locations. Of the estimated 75 North American high-density facilities, at least 15 are shared by multiple libraries. And I was thinking this morning, I didn't take the time to create slides to show you some of the evolution and the history of these shared print regional repositories, but I think that that would have been a nice thing to include. So I'm just going to go on to my next concluding points. High density shelving offers significant advantages. They're cheaper to build. There are economies of scale. They have the additional feature of reducing energy consumption because of the reduced space needed to store the items, lower lighting needs, and because items are accessed less often. High density shelving doesn't solve the problem of sea levels rising, and archivists confronting flooded collections doesn't stop global warming. But as librarians and archivists, we are presented with a new paradigm, and our ability to adapt means being brave enough to challenge our a priori understandings and assumptions of our profession. And I'm really hoping to work on some of these problems with many of you in the room. And I have to say, I'm not happy about impending disaster and incredibly incomprehensible losses that we have created and that we face. But I am grateful to have colleagues brave enough to look ahead and work together. And that does make me feel optimistic, like there is actually something that I can do. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you first of all to the organizers of this colloquium for creating this space to have these important conversations. We really appreciate it. My name is Eamon Tewell. I'm a reference and instruction librarian at Long Island University in Brooklyn, New York, home of the Blackbirds. With me today are Angela Galvan, who's at SUNY Geneseo in New York, and Jacob Berg, who's at the State Department in Washington, D.C. Before we get started, I should probably get my notes. So I'll do that. So in our presentation, we're going to be talking about resilience, mostly as it's applied to library workers and within academic libraries in our workplaces. So we're thinking more about resilience in terms of people instead of resilience in terms of environmental resilience, right? So that's an important distinction to make. So I'd like to just briefly mention how I've come to understand resilience. I know a lot of people are familiar with that term, but we're going to be focusing on it in today's presentation, so I'll just briefly go over that. So resilience, as we all know, is everywhere nowadays, from preparing for environmental catastrophes to becoming better business leaders and everywhere in between. So it's this term applied to all sorts of different fields to various degrees, right? Regardless of the context, resilience is esteemed to be fundamentally good, something that's beyond reproach, something that we should all strive for, and that's something that we hope to change your mind on in today's presentation. So first, let's talk about where that idea of resilience really comes from. So it is a term used to describe withstanding or adjusting to stressors of various kinds, whether that's individuals, whether that's environments or structures. It is considered the ability to bounce back, and you hear this term again and again, bounce back from something, from a severe setback, to successfully adapt to a disturbance or a disaster of some type. So in the 70s and 80s, resilience was adopted by researchers in ecology. The term was developed in 1973 by C.S. Halling in particular, who described ecosystems that continue to function more or less the same despite adversity that they faced. And decades later, we see resilience has become part of the dominant discourse in disaster management, in architecture, and in urban planning. So this popularity of resilience, these are just some springs behind that. The popularity of resilience has skyrocketed, along with the increased pace and severity of catastrophes and disasters. Resilience is increasingly used in discussions as diverse as international finance, the psychology of trauma, public health, urban design, and libraries. So we see how resilience is conflated across wildly different areas with this quote, right? Comparing boardrooms to cancer wards, among other things. That's a problem, right? So from its beginning in ecology, right, we see that it's gradually been reconceived as a property which people naturally possess and simply need to cultivate, and we see that as being an issue. So it's important to ask what work resilience does, socially and politically. What are we being resilient from? Who does resilience benefit? And we'll briefly introduce some issues I see with resilience. So at its core, resilience individualizes. It serves to reproduce an ideology wherein people are entirely responsible for themselves. It tells us that if we aren't able to find 10% in our budgets to cut and still provide the same service, or if we aren't able to take up the work that an unfilled position leaves, it's our problem and our shortcoming. Resilience outsources this work of addressing and coping with systemic inequality to individuals. If you feel the negative effects of sexism, then resilience says it's your fault because you haven't learned how to bounce back well enough. Here's a poster from, oh, whoops, that's a good quote. I'll just leave that up for a second. So that's one of the problems we see. So here's a poster from Tracy Washington, an attorney and activist in New Orleans, that she put up after Hurricane Katrina struck. And the residents were receiving praise for their resilience. So resilience has this effect of naturalizing that which is not natural or given, complex social systems, environmental racism, and so forth. It encourages us to accept these relations at face value and take them for granted. So it doesn't ask, how can we change this system in order to make it better? It asks us, how can you cope in order to maintain the existing system, right? So, those most vulnerable to the shocks of modern capitalism are the ones charged with becoming more resilient against them. This demand for resilience is especially troubling, considering the widespread precarity in the library and archives workforce, and the adjunctification that we see more and more of in higher education. Resilience amplifies already existing privilege by relying on this myth of meritocracy, but in reality, it takes resources to be resilient. The result is that gendered and racial discrimination is hidden by a facade of objectivity and personal perseverance. So I'd just like to end by saying that there are aspects to resilience that are important to encourage. Sometimes simply persisting in the face of adversity is the most significant act of resistance that there is, especially in today's political climate. The problem is, as I see it, that resilience is used to prop up dominant ideologies. Because risk and vulnerability are outcomes of political and economic power being exercised, confronting risk and calling out resilience means confronting power. the most effective way to confront power is collectively, whether that's in a union or through another mechanism. And if we truly want to respond to shocks and crises that we're experiencing in our workplaces, that means collective action, and that means it can't be done effectively on the individual level, right? So resisting resilience in our workplaces means organizing to build up our own power. So I'll turn it over to Angela, who will be speaking on resilience in academic libraries in particular.
Keep meaning to put a picture on this slide, and always forgetting. So I'm sorry about that. Am I being picked up? Can people hear me? All right. Okay. Might move it down. Perils of being short. Okay. This is the last time I'd be on a panel with people who are that much taller than me, because this always happens. So I've been thinking a lot about the intersection of various views of the end times and eschatology and resilience a lot lately, perhaps because every day there seems to be a great unwinding and a sustained campaign to unmake the institutions capable of producing someone like me. I'm very aware of this on Mother's Day, born a couple of months too early in the early 80s to a teen Latino mother who didn't graduate high school. I should not be here at all, were it not for those institutions. She's very proud of the fact that she got her GED and went on to finish 2 degrees. But I think that the GED post the day before my birthday, back when they put you in witness protection when you were an unwed teen mother, you know, those kinds of things. So I'm very aware of those things today, not only as a late bloomer academic, second career librarian, but most importantly, someone who comes from, you know, the working class. I've been called resilient my entire life, as though it were a thing to be proud of and uphold, rather than having those people who said that direct the energy toward breaking down the reasons I had to be resilient in the first place. My failures, and there were many of them, as all my undergraduate professors will tell you, became my own, but any successes were gleefully incorporated into the marketing narratives of all the institutions I attended, it being especially helpful that I'm white. But, you know, back to our current eschatologies for a moment, the end is never slow the way we portray it. It always happens very quickly, unless we are living in, as I suspect, a version of William Gibson's Jackpot, and we're to be overcome with illness, fires, floods, and various hordes, of which, of course, we're not members. That matters because every prepper with a well-stocked basement forgets that the end won't come fast. You know, likely we'll live through it for many years and decide then what path to take as a civilization. So in this way, resilience can offer an opportunity for survival, but only if it comes from institutions. And it isn't used by institutions to exploit workers, which is how resilience is currently modeled in higher education in particular. Right now, resilience in libraries and higher ed is point-blank exploitive. There's no way around how it's being used. So we hear continuously how much the public values libraries. Pew tells us that we're among the most valued and trusted professions anywhere, except when it comes to calls for funding. FEMA has designated public libraries in particular, and they did this after Katrina, as essential to a community's recovery from a crisis or a disaster, but the mechanisms used to fund libraries are continually threatened all of the time, you know, seemingly in ignorance to this. And so the response has been do more with less and be very proud of it. Librarians, I think, and to an extent archivists, although you guys push back a little bit more than we do, are very, very proud of the fact that we survived a budget cut, and here's exactly how we did that and all the ways we made it more efficient. And I joke that, because I'm actually in the middle of a job search right now, and I joke now that I would really like 2 jobs instead of the 4 that I have. Just like all the other librarians, I want 2 jobs instead of the 4. That you burn out your staff, and then it's also created a class, I think, of mercenary practitioners in libraries and archives who do have the ability to leave, who can leave dysfunctional employers, you know, but in doing so take a ton of institutional memory and workflows and productivity with them. So, yeah, the talent drain is a huge problem, right? And still, as a profession, we're completely incapable of saying no. Yesterday I followed along with discussion and saw lots about archives not collecting everything, just like libraries shouldn't do everything if they can't either. The concept of what do we migrate forward as a result of tradition versus what needs to work every day, I think, is a great one. So I'm going to take that home and start talking with people. So these practices are centered in this idea of the library as place as a character in a resiliency narrative where stories of overcoming intense odds or adversity are constructed and consumed by grant agencies, especially post-Katrina school libraries, or the many offers of attention that came to the Ferguson Library after the uprising, including things like the website redesign and donations, and I'll come catalog, and I'll engage in a great deal of free labor for you. So, you know, libraries are important. My university president tells me as the infrastructure of SUNY libraries will collapse system-wide, probably within the next 10 to 15 years if they don't do that. So this is the problem. As Eamon was saying, that at its core, resilience offers an individual response to a structural problem the way it's currently presented. So how can we recover if we're not given the tools? And again, it centers the library as place as a character in a resiliency narrative. So one of the things that happened in Baltimore, I remember correcting someone who claimed that poor people started a fire in a trash can outside one of the public branch libraries in Baltimore, and I said, poor people don't burn libraries, fascists do. Only to find out that that had been set off by a tear gas canister. So yes, in fact, a fascist library. Yeah, it's not a poor person who did that. So there's all this narrative correction that happens. This picture, which I won't get into, but I could teach an entire class about this picture. Yeah, so library do all these things and are all these things because in a lot of ways we're professional martyrs, and resilience feeds into that. It wasn't about the isms and various offenses, is that you're not strong enough to deal with that, and there's so much going on in this picture, but I'll pass over it because the reaction suggests you're all unpacking it too very quickly. Let's see. So that makes everything about our work our responsibility, regardless of our level of power within a given system, and the absence of agency in the structure becomes a moral failing, you know, as all of us have said. We do tend to take on the shape of our oppressors, so it shouldn't be save libraries, it should be libraries save, like even the way that we talk about our marketing and the way that we talk about ourselves. It's, you know, there's all kinds of ways that we are, all of it's responsive, it's not proactive. Speaking directly is that the end game of resilience is that stuff becomes more important than people, and this continues to happen in academic libraries in particular. This is from a university in Canada. This is from a University of New Brunswick that actually had to explain to the faculty that no, you're not losing content because we're cutting Web of Science, you're losing an aggregator. And the fact that that conversation even has to take place is a little problematic. So they're constantly having to explain, no, this is what we're cutting. And this came from the provost office at the library provost office at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which I'll just read because it's ridiculous. Until recently, UMadison had been the only institution among the 114 Association of Research Libraries that provided data showing more is spent on salaries and wages than on library materials. Recent efforts to increase the total spent on library materials and to reduce the total spent on salaries and wages have enabled us to transfer dollars to the library's materials budget, which is completely unsustainable because my salary doesn't go up 5 to 6% each year, but Springer assumes that it does, Sage assumes that it does, ACS assumes way more than that. And I don't want to talk about Elsevier, and I can't because of an NDA, which is a whole other lecture. But this kind of rhetoric explicitly centers things over people, which is the end game of resilience. It's the end game of being told, if you can't handle the kinds of organizational change that's coming down, it's your fault, you're deficient, not the systems that you're working in. And so because of that, resilience has to come from institutions, not people. I don't have enough time to get into LSU versus the behemoth of which we do not speak, but that's another example of that. This idea of we can just move it all online and we will save it, which has also been echoed here. You can't really because they will just arbitrarily turn it off. And that resilience at an institutional level can't combat the kind of ignorance and arrogance displayed by content providers. Those of you who followed along with ACRL 17, where a rep from Elsevier, speaking of the behemoth, said, well, I don't know how much our stuff costs, but I feel bad for people who can't purchase it, and said it in an open access panel. So there is that. We'll pass things over to Jacob.
All right, I guess everybody can hear me. Good stuff. This comes from the Center for the Future of Libraries. There are a group of trends here, one of which is resilience. libraries find themselves sort of at the center of two competing narratives. On one hand, libraries are resilient institutions, and that is they've been around for thousands of years, even as individual libraries rise and fall. Alexandria, for example. The concept of libraries remains. And yet, on the other hand, we sort of we have this Sturm und Drang and hand-waving these think pieces about the end of libraries and what might happen. And one concern here is how the narrative of libraries that are resilient institutions turns into librarians and library staff and archivists would also become resilient. With that in mind, a lovely slide for you all. This graphic here is all of the trends from ALA's Center for the Future of Libraries drawn out. It is very nice of ALA to provide all of us with conference bingo right off the bat. So if you like trends and buzzwords, here they are. I've put a little gold star, yes, over resilience, which, good times, fun stuff. So what I want to do is talk about ways that libraries can combat the narrative of resiliency. And the ways that I go about that are giving people space to fail, and then sort of the interaction between collection development and enabling counter narratives. You all are more than welcome to go to the Center for the Future of Libraries site. The trend of resilience that ALA mentions very explicitly comes out and says that libraries may need to compete for resiliency resources in terms of disaster and the like. That is that libraries are placed in and here's another buzzword alert, neoliberal competition for resiliency resources. It's one more thing that libraries have to do, and this ties back in with Angela's comment about library workers doing 4 jobs. One of those jobs will be competing with other city, state, local institutions with regards to those scarce resilience resources and funds. All right, here's what resilience looks like at the State Department. There's a Center of Excellence in Foreign Affairs Resilience. You can see that there's a lovely mission. And so I work for the academic wing of state at the Foreign Service Institute. That is the diplomatic training wing of state. We've got people coming and going, different places, far flung, often with families in tow. It can be pretty stressful to figure out where in Tashkent, you might need to find schooling and a house and learn the language and what have you. On top of that, there is the current administration, which may be encouraging some people to perhaps retire and transition from one career to another. So we literally have a center devoted to this concept. It's baked into the mission. Here's an actual course description. I've helpfully highlighted the thing at the bottom. I've written there. Happy Mother's Day, everybody. It's nice to hear my kids probably won't grow up to be miserable and depressed and regretful on everything I have done. That is some really good parental angst on a day like today. Much appreciated. By the way, all of this is on the open internet. These aren't state secrets. Don't worry about it. So when we develop collections, this is kind of sort of what we're up against. And here are some of the other courses that we're involved in. You can see that this is mostly on an individual level when we refer to resilience. So with that in mind, one way to introduce counter narratives is via collection development. The 3 of us have identified some resources here that we think are very useful. They enable counter narratives. If there are any catalogers, technical services people here or listening out there on Facebook, I would say please purchase these books. We don't have an Amazon affiliate link. We don't get paid off of this. but make sure that you hit those 650 fields, mark catalogers, tag things up with grit and resilience, hit those keywords, so that when people do searches for these terms, they find not just one side of the equation, but others. We'll add here that people don't like that Angela Duckworth book on grit over at State. I've been explicitly told that we don't need to purchase it. There's been a significant amount of backlash towards it, which I find interesting. But I think it also means that that there are certainly people out there who are amenable to the counter narratives and that they do have an effect. Paul Tuff, in some ways, gets the ball rolling in terms of this grit and resilience stuff, but I think his argument is much more nuanced than he gets a lot of credit for. That's one of the books that I would recommend. So we've got this lovely side-eye gif here, and someone who walks 12 miles to work 5 days a week who's held out as an exemplar, rather than, wow, that's really fucked up, that you would go ahead and have to do that. So this is Robin James, who was mentioned in the previous slide, makes the argument that resilience is capitalism. It's used to extract labor. Here's a quote from Dr. James. And it is, resilience is the practice of making evident a lot of noisy damage so that you can then spectacularly overcome it in a way that produces surplus value for both you, in the form of, say, human or social capital, and for society as a whole. You can think of it like shock doctrine capitalism for the individual psyche, especially the individual psyches of people from oppressed groups. Resilience is a specific type of therapeutic overcoming. It has 3 steps. Perform damage so that others can see, feel, and understand it. Recycle or overcome that damage so that you come out ahead of where you were even before the damage hit. 3, pay that surplus value, that value added by recycling, to some hegemonic institution, like white supremacist patriarchy or capital or the state, something like that. This isn't just coping. It's a very, very specific form of coping designed to get individuals to perform these superficial trappings of recovery from deep systemic issues, all the while reinforcing and intensifying the very systemic issues it claims to solve. Resilience is how patriarchy hides behind superficial feminist liberation, how white supremacy hides behind superficial multiculturalism. This also ties in with something that Nora mentioned yesterday, that there's this discourse of the Anthropocene itself as something to be overcome, a performance of resilience for libraries and library staff, as well as archives as well. And so while counter-narratives can be difficult, it's up to people in positions of power to work towards that. One way to do that is to think like a Marxist. It was mentioned yesterday, think like an anarchist. They ask the best questions. To me, Marx asks the best questions, then he asks who benefits? Who benefits from these narratives about resiliency, about the Anthropocene? When libraries are positioned in terms of having to work and battle for capital, for resources with other institutions, who benefits there? As you can see, we've got these lovely counter narratives here. What resilience asks you to do as someone who's in the position of a library supervisor, of a hiring manager. Please, please, please help create a culture where people don't need to be resilient, people don't need to perform it. It's okay to be, as Robin James says, be melancholy. Don't pay that surplus damage forward towards the institution that's really oppressing you. It's have conferences about how libraries, librarians, library staff fail. ACRL Maryland has done this. Code for Lib does this. They have something called Fail for Lib. And so libraries and institutions don't have to perform resilience. Let's make sure that libraries, along with the planet, are still here in that thousands of years narrative. Thank you.
We're gonna move about 10 minutes forward. So we'll have 10 minutes now for questions, and then we can start the next panel 10 minutes late, and then we'll just have 50 minutes for lunch, but I think you'll all be okay with that.
Oh my God. I'm like, thank you for taking me to church on Sunday morning. So yeah, I actually wanted to like jump up and down yelling, yeah, yes, 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 but I actually constrained myself. So I think what y'all talked about in your presentations goes directly back to our connection to place, right? And you all talked about that in very different ways without actually talking about it in some cases directly. And I want to touch on something that Angela brought up, which is that, you know, for so many people in our field, we have to, you know, in order to, we're mercenary practitioners. I've never heard it put that way, but that's such a good way to put it. How do we, given the work that we have ahead is so place-based, is so connected, how do we actually do that work if we're all like being mercenary practitioners, besides abolishing capitalism?
Right, so abolishing capitalism being on an ultimate to-do list, but for now, a lot of that has to come from leadership and from the environments locally that we're allowed to foster. One of the things that does create, you know, a mercenary class, I think, especially for archivists, is just the long-term precarity. And then when you do get, you know, into a position that's less so, the idea that you, I've talked about this with a couple of archivists in both the United States and Canada, where they've said, I've asked them, because I was in a very similar position, do you ever stop checking your back? Do you ever stop looking for a job, especially as your experience matriculates and you do become more qualified for positions? Where do you settle? You know, where do you stop, kind of thing? So you have this, your CV ends up having a problem where you have a lot of different jobs, but also you end up being fairly skilled, and so people want you, but they're also kind of wary. And I think that there is a desire on the part of, you know, the mercenary class to settle and to have a sense of place, but ultimately I think leadership has to allow us to do that in the first place. So whether that's with adequate resources in terms of pay, or in terms of skilling, or in terms of just the local infrastructure that we have to work with, there's a lot of ways that that can be supported. Mostly pay people. Mostly pay people.
Yeah, I agree. It has to come from leadership, and I think we have very, very poor leadership in many libraries. And if I walk around saying, how do these people get hired? Like, I don't understand. And in some ways, I think it's so we can continue this practice. But I think that there's so little attention paid. I work in a very large public library system. We have 60 branches, and I'm always aghast at, you know, the emphasis on customer service and like, you know, service, and yet there's so little the model of servant leadership, where the leadership is serving the people that they lead instead of constantly focusing on the end product, which is the customer, right? And not thinking at all that an investment in your staff is what essentially is going to get you that end result. I'm just like, so that needs to happen, and I don't know how or who's going to instruct these leaders, but it's sad. We were just talking about that last night at dinner.
So the comment that I'd like to make on that, I'm a 3/4 time librarian, and the reason is because my professional job as a librarian doesn't feed that sense of place. So what I'm doing in the other quarter time is I'm writing for a local magazine, and I'm involved with local environmental groups. And so my library profession is informed by these other activities, but I had to go outside the library to actually engage with the community the way I like to do.
I'll chime in real quickly if I can. I don't think that anything will come from leadership. I don't think we can rely, if we're talking about leadership in terms of management, that it can't and probably won't happen. I think that it would have to come from ourselves working collectively instead. That's just me and my institution, which is particularly bad. So if you have
So you might guess what I'm going to say. Being an archivist who stepped up, and trust me, you know, there's a lot of aspects of higher ed administration and management that aren't fun, but we are the leadership.
Yeah, I want to, I think, second Eamon's point here. I say this as someone who is a library director. It's not that you can't rely on me individually, but you cannot rely on us. All I can do is absorb some of that damage and practice that servant leadership, and sort of clear the way to make sure that librarians and library staff can get their jobs done. All I can do is ask that my staff not perform resilience and things like that, and hopefully that creates the space for people to organize and such.
I'm really concerned about the conflation of the uses of the term resilience. I'm skeptical that there's even a connection between these two uses of the term, but maybe we can take the opportunity to try to find something like that. The labor issues are obviously important to everyone here, so maybe you can comment on a connection between labor issues or Marxist insights to the problems that we've come together at this colloquium to talk about.
All right, so I guess for folks who didn't catch it, Rory wants to discuss the relationship, really, if any, between these two different types of resilience. To go back to ALA's Center for the Future of Libraries, it's something that they conflate as well, that on one hand, there is this concept of resiliency out there that especially public libraries have to compete for in terms of funding and resources with regards to other state institutions. And I'm saying state here, not meaning federal state,
Well,
but
you're discussing
yeah.
a conflation between resiliency of staff and resiliency of libraries as institutions. The term as it's used at this colloquium is primarily about the resiliency of communities in the face of environmental change, having, well, maybe something to do with current political economic realities, but I think there are fundamentally different concerns between there are people who are green Marxists and working on connections there, but what are those connections in this context?
I would say, and before I pass the mic to Angela, is that libraries per ALA are explicitly placed into a competition for resources in terms of the performance of resiliency, and then that falls to library staff, to archivists, to archival staff.
So one of the ways that these overlap were discussed by both of you, actually in different ways, the idea that there are localized and more ancient ways of knowing, and that may be a way to genuinely get at interpersonal and local resilience on the part of staff, is that we will learn about things which are useful in terms of a response, and not things like ignore sexism, which is currently how resilience is applied. So, but the way that both of you have described it individually, the local and older ways of knowing things and of retaining knowledge are definitely kind of where that intersection happens, where it's not necessarily conflated, but where it becomes a useful term. So that may partially answer Rory's question.
Yeah, my just quick comment is that I think resilience as a useful term has been hollowed out of a lot of its potential, right? So it's been kind of depoliticized, appropriated, and I think it's a still useful idea, but the potential for it being useful is decreasing as we go.
One of the Oh, by the way, Jodi, Leo Ketke has a great song called "Living Off the Grid." So you got to listen. You got maybe probably up on YouTube, but "Living Off the Grid" by Leo. I was sort of like listening to this whole thing on resilience, and Rory raises a really good point. If you look at resilience, whether institutionally or individually, as a response to some sort of a catastrophic event or something gone bad, and we react and do something good in response to that to try to at least the reaction being, if you're going to be adapting, which I say like adapting. We talked yesterday about climate change. It says it doesn't solve the root cause of the root problem. So you're rewarded for your ability to adapt or your to overcome, and you're rewarded. And how are we rewarded? Well, they give you more stuff that's bad and catastrophic. So it comes up with Angela. I liked what she said about saying no and things. It says, because what we need to do as librarians is learning how to say no, because there will come a time when you say yes just one more time too many, and the whole house of yes cards comes collapsing down on you as usually on you as an individual first, and then the institution. And as a fellow SUNY librarian, I feel your pain.
Okay, yeah. I think Mark, you have a question. Then we have a question in the back.
Yeah, I guess my question, just a comment that I still come back to the resiliency. It's clearly been co-opted. I have to admit, I learned quite a bit today. I tend to think, and this might be my own bias or privilege, but tend to think of it more in just purely environmental terms. But I just see it as whoever's in power is always going to look at ways to normalize. And I don't think it's done in a boardroom like that. We need to normalize this situation. It's like the air we breathe a lot of the times, and sometimes it's not. It's clearly, you see memos, decisions were made that were racist, sexist, and so forth. But to me, I just see it as like, again, the collapse or a collapse happens to people individually. Sometimes it's whole demographics. You go in Albany, you only have to drive like a mile and you can see a whole neighborhood that is experiencing collapse on some level. So we use the word resilience to normalize that, and I just see that as part of it's been going on throughout time, but I think as resources get fewer and fewer, climate change, that's still going to go on. We're not all going to just kind of rally around the campfire and say, let's all divide up everything equally. People are going to hold on to their power. I think someone was saying that yesterday, that they have stakeholders, they're still going to have that boards and so forth. So to me, this language co-opting just seems normal to normalize something that's all around us. I mean, you just go outside and collapse, it's already happened for lots of people. So anyways, it's a little bit of a meta conversation what Rory's talking about, resilience, and I think it's still a good, useful conversation, because you start talking to someone about resilience and they, like you're pointing out, they kind of rear back, and like I need to know, like, is this word sort of loaded for them? So that was really useful.
This question is for both Amy and Jodi. I appreciated all the presentations, but I was really drawn to your two in particular. Amy, I was struck that a lot of the fiction you presented were sort of modes of generating ecological knowledge. And Amy, some of the off-pipe, off-grid concepts or tools that you presented have a real base in science inquiry. And so I'm curious about the role of libraries to function as labs in a community where people can come and engage in scientific research and have libraries be a space where that happens outside of a formal scientific research institution.
I think that's a great idea, yeah. Or library as hub. Library is the main, we have the infrastructure, we have, I come from public libraries, but there's a library in every neighborhood in industrialized nations. So we're already there. It seems like a natural fit for that kind of thing to take place.
So one of the things I did at the University of Utah the last semester was I was working with a biology class, and the students were developing citizen science projects centered around urban urban wildlife, and they were making a proposal to the museum about a display that the museum was going to put together. So that's an idea of how you could, the library could help collect the data. I was advising the students how to find research to make their proposals, and eventually one of the proposals will actually be implemented. So that idea of citizen science is a way that libraries could get involved, and my role was as a facilitator, not as somebody developing the project. It's not yet. So what happened is that the professor that I was working with made an agreement with the museum. The museum people heard all the student proposals, and they're going to pick one or two to create a display. So it's not yet up, but one day something will be there.
One more question, and then we'll move to the next. Is this working? Can you hear me?
No. I mean, we can
How
hear
about
you.
now?
Oh, there. Now we can.
So I really just have a couple comments. One is just really unintellectual, but it's just sort of a shout out for the composting toilet.
Yay!
I was hiking at the top of the Sierra Nevada in Yosemite, and I came to this High Sierra camp that had a composting toilet, and it was really cold, and so the toilet is warm. It smells good. The cedar chips. Like I'm all for this technology.
Works on so many levels.
Yeah, it does. On a more library-oriented note, I guess I should say, I would really hope we do a reading list or bibliography for this meeting. There's so many great references that everyone is giving in these talks and that I'm hearing in conversation. And if people want to do that, I'd be willing to help do that. I just think it's really great. So
We've got a plan.
good.
Rory has a plan.
Be on the lookout for a Google Doc. Thank you.